The freezing November rain in Portland felt warm compared to my husband's eyes as he drove away, abandoning our baby and me in the dark. I thought that was the ultimate betrayal until a luxury car stopped. A man stepped out claiming he had searched for me for 20 years. My 5-year marriage was a staged play, and this stranger held a secret worth tens of millions of dollars that my husband desperately wanted to steal. Welcome back to Violet Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has disabled monetization on our channel, leaving us without the budget needed to keep operating. If you find today's story compelling, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our dedicated staff to cover their living expenses and continue creating these stories for you. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on the screen or clicking the link in the description and comments. My name is Evelyn, and this is the night my life shattered and rebuilt itself. The relentless November rain of Portland lashed violently against the windshield, the wipers fighting a losing battle against the freezing downpour. The heater in the car was running on full blast, yet a suffocating chill filled the tight space between the driver's seat and the passenger side. We were driving down a desolate stretch of a suburban road, entirely swallowed by absolute darkness. Greg gripped the steering wheel so fiercely his knuckles turned completely white. Just minutes earlier, the silence of our drive had been shattered by an explosive, utterly baseless argument. He had suddenly thrust a thick stack of legal documents into my lap, demanding my immediate signature. It was a bizarre, sweeping power of attorney form that would grant him absolute, unquestioned control over any and all assets under my name. When I questioned the necessity of such an extreme demand, refusing to blindly sign away my rights, his usual charming demeanor vanished, a terrifying, cold fury replaced the face of the man I had loved for 5 years. Without warning, Greg slammed his heavy boot on the brake pedal. The tires screeched against the slick asphalt, sending the car sliding slightly before jolting to a violent halt on the gravel shoulder. My heart hammered against my ribs in pure shock. Before I could even ask what he was doing, Greg reached over, unbuckled my seatbelt, and shoved his door open. He marched around the hood of the car, yanked the passenger door wide open, and grabbed my arm with a crushing grip. He physically hauled me out into the freezing storm. I stumbled, my knees scraping hard against the rough, wet pavement. I screamed his name, demanding to know what possessed him, but his eyes were entirely empty, devoid of any warmth or humanity. He then opened the rear door, forcefully unbuckled our baby boy Leo, and practically threw the screaming child into my arms. Leo immediately shrieked, the icy rain stinging his delicate face. Greg slammed the heavy metal door shut, marched back to the driver's seat, and pressed his foot down hard on the gas. The tires spun wildly, kicking up freezing mud onto my legs as the red tail lights sped away, quickly disappearing into the black, unforgiving night. I stood frozen on the side of that abandoned road, the torrential rain soaking completely through my thin coat in seconds. The darkness was absolute, save for the occasional distant flash of lightning that illuminated the towering, skeletal trees framing the empty highway. Panic, cold and sharp as a butcher knife, sliced through my chest. My legs trembled violently, threatening to give out beneath the crushing weight of betrayal and the physical shock of the freezing temperature. But then, a high-pitched, desperate wail snapped me entirely out of my paralysis. Leo was crying uncontrollably, his small body shivering violently against my chest. The primal, undeniable instinct of a mother surged powerfully to the surface, drowning out my own terror. I had to survive. I had to protect my son. I wrapped my coat tightly around his fragile frame, curling my body forward to act as a human shield against the relentless onslaught of the storm. I began walking blindly along the edge of the road, praying desperately for the sight of a house or a passing vehicle. Minutes felt like agonizing hours. Just as my limbs began to grow entirely numb and the terrifying reality of hypothermia started creeping into my mind, a pair of brilliant headlights pierced through the heavy curtain of rain. A sleek black luxury sedan slowed down gracefully as it approached us, its tires hissing smoothly against the wet road. It pulled over just a few feet ahead of me. My breath hitched in my throat. Fear and hope waged a violent war inside me. Was it a savior or another threat? The heavy passenger door swung open, and a middle-aged man stepped out into the raging storm. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, utterly out of place on a muddy roadside. He held no umbrella. Completely ignoring the heavy rain that instantly ruined his immaculate clothing, he walked swiftly toward us, his polished shoes splashing heavily through the deep puddles. I stepped back defensively, clutching Leo tighter, ready to run into the dark woods if I had to. But the man did not look at my panicked face, nor did he ask any of the obvious, expected questions like what I was doing out here or if I needed a ride. Instead, he stopped dead in his tracks, his intense gaze fixed directly on the hollow of my throat. He was staring at the antique turquoise stone pendant necklace I always wore, a piece I had carried with me since childhood. His chest heaved heavily, and his eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated shock. When he finally lifted his gaze to meet mine, I saw a profound mixture of relief and utter disbelief swimming in his eyes. "I have looked for you for 20 years, he said, his voice trembling heavily, carrying clearly over the loud roar of the wind and rain. Before I could process the sheer weight and impossibility of his statement, he introduced himself briefly as Silas Montgomery. Seeing my violent shivering and hearing Leo weeping, his demeanor instantly shifted from stunned realization to sharp, commanding action. He gently placed a warm hand on my shoulder, his voice firm but deeply reassuring, guiding us immediately toward the warmth of his vehicle. Once inside the plush, heated leather interior, the agonizing cold began to recede slightly. Though my mind was spinning faster than ever, Silas did not take us to a local police station or a public hospital. He drove directly to a highly secure private penthouse apartment situated high above the heart of the city. The moment we stepped into the lavish, heavily guarded sanctuary, he picked up a phone and demanded his personal family doctor arrive immediately to thoroughly examine Leo. As the heavy mahogany door clicked shut securely behind us, locking out the brutal storm and the ghost of the man who had abandoned me, I realized my nightmare was not ending. It was simply transforming into a mystery I could not begin to comprehend. The private doctor left after assuring me my sweet boy was perfectly healthy, just exhausted from the ordeal. Once I tucked my son securely beneath the thick down comforter in the guest bedroom, I quietly stepped out into the expansive living area. Silas was waiting by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering city skyline. He handed me a steaming cup of chamomile tea. The porcelain was warm against my still trembling fingers. He gestured for me to sit on the plush velvet sofa. I braced myself for police reports or legal formalities, but his first words struck me with the force of a physical blow. He began to speak about my biological father. For my entire life, my mother had told me that he was a deadbeat who ran away when I was barely walking, a man too cowardly to handle the responsibilities of a family. I had spent decades burying the sting of that abandonment. Now, sitting in this fortress in the sky, Silas gently dismantled that lie piece by piece. The rain continued to batter the reinforced glass windows of the penthouse, a stark contrast to the absolute stillness inside the room. I listened with a growing sense of disbelief as he spoke of a man I never truly knew. Silas poured himself a dark amber liquid from a crystal decanter and sat across from me. His eyes filled with a heavy sorrow. He revealed that he was not just a wealthy stranger passing by on a dark road, but my father's sworn legal counsel and the sole appointed trustee of his estate. My father did not run away from his family out of cowardice, Silas explained, his voice low and steady. He isolated himself to protect us. He was a brilliant software architect, a visionary operating decades ahead of his time, working entirely under the radar. He successfully engineered a highly advanced predictive core algorithm. In the current technology market, that single piece of code was worth tens of millions of dollars. When the violent threats from ruthless corporate competitors escalated from intimidation to physical danger, My father made a heart-wrenching decision. He chose to disappear completely to keep my mother and me entirely off their radar. He sacrificed his life with us, accepting the title of a runaway coward, just so we could live safely in obscurity without constantly looking over our shoulders, before a highly suspicious, unsolved accident claimed his life on a lonely highway. My father meticulously constructed an impenetrable legal fortress around his life work. Silas explained that a highly classified, heavily guarded trust was established, holding the exclusive patent and full ownership of the algorithm. This trust was designed with a very specific, unbreakable temporal lock. It would remain completely dormant, untouchable by any court, any corporation, and even Silas himself, until a predetermined date. That date was my 32nd birthday. My breath caught sharply in my throat as I frantically calculated the days in my head. I would turn 32 exactly 1 month from today. For all these years, I was the sole heir to a digital empire I knew absolutely nothing about, walking around with a massive target on my back while working a mundane corporate job and worrying about paying the monthly mortgage. The scattered pieces of a terrifying, sinister puzzle began to assemble in my mind. I asked Silas how he managed to find me tonight on that specific road, and what any of this ancient history had to do with the man who just left me on the side of a highway. Silas leaned forward, his expression hardening into cold, unforgiving steel. He revealed the name of the massive global tech conglomerate desperately hunting for my father's algorithm. It was the exact same parent corporation that employed Greg. The room started to spin. Silas explained that they had tracked down my identity years ago through deep background searches, but quickly realized they could not legally touch the trust or force Silas to hand it over through litigation. The only possible way to acquire the code was through me, the legal heir, but I had to hand it over willingly or through a legally binding proxy. The realization hit me with the destructive force of a freight train. My vision blurred as the last 5 years of my life rapidly rewound in my memory. Every cherished moment now tainted with poison. The charming coffee shop meet cute, where he accidentally spilled my drink, the relentless romantic pursuit, the perfect, tearful proposal under the stars, the sacred vows we exchanged at the altar, and the incredibly gentle way he held our newborn son in the delivery room. None of it was real. Every single kiss, every whispered promise in the dark. Every quiet family dinner was a meticulously calculated, brilliantly executed performance. Greg was not a loving, devoted husband. He was a ruthless corporate operative playing a long, agonizing con. He married me simply to establish a legal, marital claim to my identity and my future assets. He had been biding his time all these years, flawlessly playing the role of a supportive partner, waiting patiently for the clock to run out on my father's temporal lock. Suddenly, the explosive, seemingly irrational argument in the car made terrifying sense. The sweeping, complex power of attorney document he practically shoved into my lap was never about managing our household finances or preparing for unforeseen medical emergencies like he claimed. It was the final, critical step in his massive corporate espionage operation. He desperately needed my signature to legally absorb my entire estate and sign away my rights right before my 32nd birthday activated the trust. When I hesitated, when I stubbornly refused to blindly sign away my autonomy in the dark, I ruined a carefully orchestrated 5-year mission, with the deadline looming just weeks away and his feigned patience finally exhausted. Greg dropped his loving mask entirely. He threw us out into the freezing rain not out of a sudden fit of madness or a temporary loss of temper, but out of cold, calculated fury because his ultimate, multi-million-dollar payday was slipping through his fingers. I set the delicate porcelain teacup down heavily on the thick glass table. My hands had completely stopped shaking. The suffocating grief, the overwhelming heartbreak, and the paralyzing fear that had gripped my chest just an hour ago completely evaporated into the sterile air of the penthouse. In its place, a dark, consuming, and icy fire ignited deep within my soul. The tears I had shed for my broken marriage and my shattered family dried up instantly. Greg thought I was just a naive, weak, and disposable pawn in his high-stakes corporate game. He genuinely believed that leaving a terrified mother and a helpless child to freeze in the pitch-black dark would break my spirit, force my submission, and teach me a lesson in obedience. He fundamentally and fatally miscalculated. I looked directly at Silas, my posture straightening, the pathetic victimhood burning away into pure, unadulterated, and calculated vengeance. I was no longer the discarded, weeping wife kneeling in the roadside mud. I was the true heir to a fortune, the daughter of a genius, and I was going to tear Greg's entire existence apart piece by agonizing piece. The morning sun broke through the storm clouds, casting a harsh, unforgiving light across the penthouse. I did not waste a single second wallowing in what was lost. I immediately contacted human resources at Nexus Spire Analytics, the data firm where I worked, requesting an indefinite leave of absence for a severe family emergency. My career there, once a source of immense pride, now felt like a trivial footnote in a much larger, infinitely more dangerous narrative. I needed absolute clarity and uninterrupted time. The sprawling dining table in Silas's apartment was quickly transformed into a high-tech war room. Stacks of legal documents, encrypted laptops, and secure communication devices replaced the remnants of our morning coffee. I was no longer the blind, devoted spouse. I was an analyst dissecting a hostile takeover, and the target was my own life. Greg was a master manipulator, but his arrogance bred a fatal complacency regarding his digital footprint. Living with him for 5 years meant I knew the rhythmic cadence of his keystrokes, the fundamental logic behind his passwords, and the back doors to his personal servers. While Silas handled the complex estate law, I launched a silent, methodical strike into Greg's private cloud accounts. Bypassing his secondary authentication took less than 2 hours. What I uncovered was a meticulously archived chronicle of treason. Buried beneath layers of superficial financial spreadsheets were highly encrypted communication logs. I cracked the primary folders and found direct, ongoing correspondence between Greg and the executive board of the rival technology conglomerate. They discussed the acquisition timeline, my expected compliance, and the massive multi-million-dollar payout structured as offshore fees once the algorithm was secured, seeing his treachery spelled out in sterile. Black and white text severed any lingering emotional attachment I might have harbored. The corporate espionage was devastating, but the personal betrayal ran even deeper, woven seamlessly into his professional deceit. Digging further into a hidden partition of his drive, I unearthed a digital paper trail of a parallel domestic life. There were joint bank statements, luxury vacation itineraries, and a recently signed lease for a sprawling high-end townhouse in a neighboring state. The CO signer on all these documents was a woman named Clara. A quick search through professional databases revealed her identity. Clara was not just a random mistress. She was the current director of development at the exact same rival conglomerate Greg was conspiring with. They were not just sharing a bed. They were co-authoring my financial and psychological ruin. During his late nights and sudden conferences, he was actually building an empire with Clara using my inheritance. Right on cue, the psychological warfare from his end began. My phone lit up with a barrage of text messages and missed calls. Greg shifted his tactic from brutal abandonment to desperate, manufactured remorse. He wrote agonizing paragraphs about how the intense pressure of his job had finally broken his sanity, causing a momentary psychotic break on that dark road. He begged for my forgiveness, pleaded for me to bring our baby boy home, and swore he would spend the rest of his life making it up to me. A day ago, those words would have shattered my resolve and sent me running back to his arms. Today, they read like a poorly written script. Instead of unleashing my rage and exposing him, I swallowed my pride and played my role. I typed back short, hesitant replies. I told him I was terrified, confused, and hiding at a friend's house. I intentionally crafted messages dripping with vulnerability and naive hope, ensuring he believed I was still entirely under his emotional control. I needed his ego inflated, his guard completely lowered, and his focus fixed firmly on his imminent victory. While Greg wallowed in his false sense of security, Silas and I executed a flawless, invisible legal maneuver. The terms of my father's trust stipulated that upon my 32nd birthday, the ownership of the algorithm would default to my name. If Greg possessed the signed power of attorney on that specific day, he could legally intercept the transfer. Silas and I circumvented this entirely. Utilizing his extensive network of offshore legal contacts, we established a completely new, airtight, independent legal entity, a fortified holding company completely insulated from my personal marital assets. We drafted irrevocable directives instructing the original trust to bypass my personal accounts entirely and funnel the patent directly into this new, unassailable fortress the absolute second the temporal lock expired. By the time my birthday arrived, the millions Greg and Clara were salivating over would be legally unreachable, effectively turning their grand prize into absolute zero. With the impenetrable legal shield firmly in place and his digital confessions safely secured on multiple encrypted drives, it was time to initiate the final phase. I took a deep, steadying breath and drafted one last text message to my husband. I told him I was exhausted from fighting, that I loved him too much to throw our family away, and that I was finally ready to sign the power of attorney document if it meant we could go back to normal. I suggested we meet in a public, neutral space to finalize the paperwork and discuss bringing our son home. I hit send and watched the delivery confirmation appear. The trap was set, perfectly baited with my feigned surrender, and the predator was walking blindly right into the steel jaws. I chose a highly exclusive, softly lit French restaurant situated in the heart of the downtown financial district for our final confrontation. The ambient lighting was intentionally low, casting long, dramatic shadows against the heavy velvet-draped walls, while a live string quartet played a melancholic, classical melody in the corner of the expansive dining room. I arrived 45 minutes early to ensure the stage was perfectly set and to calm the adrenaline surging through my veins. Sitting alone at a secluded, curved leather booth, I purposefully smoothed the fabric of my plain beige dress. I had intentionally worn minimal makeup, allowing the dark circles under my eyes to show, making my face appear pale, exhausted, and thoroughly defeated. It was the exact visual representation of the broken, helpless woman Greg expected to see. Through the faint reflection of a polished silver serving tray resting on my table, I silently watched the grand mahogany entrance doors, right on the dot of our scheduled time. Greg strolled through the entrance. He wore a sharply tailored navy blue suit, his hair perfectly styled, carrying an aura of quiet, burdened martyrdom that he had perfected over the years. In his left hand, he held a massive, expensive bouquet of a dozen white roses. They were the universal, cliché symbol of innocent apology, purity, and fresh starts. He spotted me sitting in the shadows and immediately arranged his handsome facial features into a mask of profound, long-suffering sorrow. He walked over and slid into the booth directly opposite me, carefully placing the pristine white roses on the table between us like a fragile peace offering to a volatile, unpredictable enemy. He reached out, attempting to gently cover my hand with his own, but I expertly pulled my fingers back, feigning severe nervous hesitation. Greg sighed heavily, a sound dripping with manufactured, exhausted patience. He leaned in close, lowering his voice to a patronizing, sickeningly gentle whisper. He told me that he completely forgave me for my dramatic, irrational outburst on the dark road the other night. He looked deeply into my eyes and smoothly explained that he had spoken to a medical professional about my erratic behavior. According to his twisted narrative, my severe postpartum hormonal imbalances were completely warping my reality, making me dangerously paranoid, hysterical, and unfit to make rational decisions. He spun a masterful, incredibly manipulative story where he was the remarkably patient, deeply loving husband desperately trying to save his mentally fragile wife from ruining her own life and destroying their family. He assured me, his voice oozing with fake sincerity, that he was willing to completely overlook the horrible fact that I had run away and hidden our son from him. He promised that all would be forgiven, provided we could just get past this minor legal hurdle and return to our perfect, happy home together. Without breaking eye contact, he unbuttoned his suit jacket, reached into his sleek leather briefcase, and produced a thick, neatly bound stack of legal documents. He pushed the heavy file across the pristine white linen tablecloth until it rested directly in front of me. He handed me a heavy silver pen, telling me that signing the papers was the only way to prove I was truly committed to healing our fractured marriage. This was my defining moment. I let my lower lip tremble violently. I forced my breathing to become shallow, rapid, and ragged, channeling every single ounce of disgust and fury I felt into a brilliant, Oscar-worthy performance of a pathetic, desperate wife. Hot tears spilled over my eyelashes and streamed rapidly down my cheeks. I buried my face in my hands, letting out a series of loud, humiliating sobs that echoed slightly in the quiet restaurant. Greg immediately looked around the elegant dining room, his face flushing with intense irritation and severe embarrassment at the public spectacle I was causing, as he quickly turned his head away to avoid the judgmental, staring eyes of a wealthy elderly couple at the adjacent table. I smoothly dropped my hands, in one fluid, heavily practiced motion. I slid his thick legal file directly onto my lap and simultaneously pulled an identical-looking, meticulously prepared document stack from my oversized tote bag, placing it squarely on the table in front of me. I picked up the silver pen with a visibly shaking hand. Sniffling loudly and wiping my eyes, I flipped directly to the final page of my decoy document and slowly, deliberately signed my full legal name on the dotted line. I pushed the signed document back across the table, keeping my tear-filled eyes fixed firmly on the tablecloth in a display of total, unconditional submission. Greg did not even bother to read the preceding pages. His greedy eyes locked instantly onto my fresh ink signature at the bottom of the page. A sharp, completely uncontrollable smirk of pure, triumphant victory broke right through his carefully constructed mask of fake concern. He snatched the file off the table, shoving it hastily into his leather briefcase as if he was afraid I might change my mind and take it back. Then, he immediately pulled his smartphone from his jacket pocket. His thumbs flew across the illuminated screen at lightning speed. I knew exactly what he was doing and exactly who he was talking to. He was furiously texting Clara, gleefully reporting that the naive, foolish prey had finally taken the bait, that the multi-million-dollar algorithm was officially under their control, and that their incredibly wealthy, luxurious future together was entirely secured. Greg stood up abruptly, buttoning his jacket with an air of absolute, arrogant superiority. He looked down at me, his tone now brisk, cold, and entirely devoid of any lingering warmth or fake sympathy. He coldly instructed me to finish my dinner alone, stating he would come pick up me and the baby at exactly 8 o'clock tonight so we could go back to the house, as he turned his heel, ready to march proudly out of the restaurant and into his stolen fortune. I stopped crying. The violent trembling in my hands ceased instantly. I casually picked up my crystal water glass, took a slow, elegant sip, and finally spoke. My voice was no longer a fragile, broken whisper, but a freezing, razor-sharp blade that sliced right through the ambient jazz music of the room. "Before you rush off to celebrate your massive victory with Clara," I stated, dropping her name like a live grenade into the small space between us, "you might want to check your corporate email. I sent a very comprehensive, fully documented gift straight to the head of human resources at your firm." Greg froze entirely in his tracks. The smug, victorious color violently drained from his handsome face, leaving him a sickening, hollow shade of chalky white. He whipped his head around, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes, as if I had just transformed into a monster right in front of him. I smiled at him, a chilling, dead-eyed smile, and calmly informed him that I knew every single sordid detail about his 5-year espionage operation, his hidden offshore bank accounts, and his parallel domestic life. I then softly advised him to actually open his briefcase and read the document he had just so triumphantly snatched from the table. I told him it was absolutely not a power of attorney granting him my family inheritance, but a legally binding, certified copy of a unilateral divorce petition, completely stripping him of every single marital asset and exposing his massive corporate fraud. A terrifying, primal rage violently contorted his features. He let out a guttural, animalistic sound and lunged violently across the dining table, sending the crystal glasses and the vase of white roses crashing to the floor, his hands reaching desperately for my throat. But before his fingers could even graze my skin, two massive men in dark suits stepped out from the shadows of the adjacent booths. Silas's private bodyguards grabbed Greg forcefully by his shoulders, violently slamming him back down into his chair and pinning his arms behind his back. Dozens of wealthy diners gasped loudly and turned to watch in absolute, stunned silence as the perfect, charming husband was physically restrained, completely outsmarted, and publicly destroyed. At precisely 8 o'clock the very next morning, the crushing weight of reality slammed into Greg's meticulously constructed corporate life. The massive dossier I had promised was delivered simultaneously to the inbox of every single board member and the head of human resources at his rival technology conglomerate. It contained everything. I had provided every encrypted message, the offshore account details, and undeniable proof that his 5-year marriage was a premeditated espionage operation designed to steal highly classified trade secrets. Corporate loyalty is a complete myth, especially when federal felonies are involved. To entirely insulate themselves from the massive legal fallout of industrial espionage, the board of directors reacted with ruthless, immediate efficiency. By 9:30, they had formally terminated both Greg and Clara. They immediately canceled his comprehensive health benefits, revoked his lucrative severance package, and voided every single unvested stock option he had accumulated. In less than 2 hours, the corporate masters he had sold his soul to had unceremoniously thrown him to the wolves. By noon, Greg was no longer the arrogant, sharply dressed operative who had strutted out of the French restaurant. He was a frantic, desperate animal. Knowing I was staying at Silas's heavily guarded building, he somehow managed to get past the lobby security. I had specifically instructed the front desk to allow him to ride the private elevator up, knowing exactly what was about to happen. When I opened the heavy mahogany door, the sight of him was absolutely pitiful. His expensive silk tie was loosened, his hair was wildly disheveled, and the manufactured charm was entirely gone, replaced by a raw, suffocating panic. He immediately fell to his knees in the marble hallway, real tears streaming down his face as he began to beg. He swore frantically that he still loved me and our baby boy. He spun a pathetic, desperate lie, claiming that the entire espionage plot was forced upon him by his ruthless superiors, that he was merely a helpless pawn following direct orders to keep his job, and that his feelings for me had become completely genuine over the years. I did not utter a single word of comfort. I simply stepped back and pushed the heavy double doors wide open. Greg's desperate pleas died instantly in his throat as his eyes adjusted to the scene unfolding inside the expansive living room. The sanctuary was no longer just a quiet, legal war room. Silas stood by the glass dining table, but he was not alone. 3 stern-looking federal agents from the Economic Crime Division, wearing dark windbreakers, were meticulously packing hard drives and cataloging the mountain of financial evidence we had gathered. They were officially building a massive federal indictment for wire fraud, corporate espionage, and criminal conspiracy to misappropriate trust assets. Greg remained frozen on his knees, his jaw completely slack, as the terrifying reality of his situation finally registered. He was not just facing a messy, expensive divorce. He was staring straight down the barrel of a lengthy federal prison sentence. Right at that exact moment of agonizing silence, Greg's smartphone began to vibrate violently in his jacket pocket. The screen flashed Clara's name brightly, in his state of absolute shock. His shaking fingers accidentally fumbled the screen, answering the call and putting it on speakerphone for the entire room to hear. Clara did not say hello. She unleashed a hysterical, ear-piercing barrage of expletives and wild accusations. Her voice echoed harshly off the marble walls, screaming that she had just been publicly escorted out of her office building by armed security guards. She viciously cursed Greg for being so incredibly incompetent, for letting a supposedly naive housewife outsmart them both, and for leaving a glaring digital trail that was now guaranteeing them decades behind bars. She sobbed wildly, calling him a useless, pathetic failure before abruptly ending the call. The silence that followed was incredibly heavy. It was the absolute lowest point of human degradation, a perfectly pathetic display of thieves turning violently on each other the second their sinking ship went down. Stripped of his dignity, his wealthy lover, and his lucrative career, a dark, venomous spite quickly replaced Greg's panic. Like a cornered, rabid rat, he scrambled to his feet, his handsome face twisting into an ugly, hateful sneer. If he was going down, he was violently determined to drag me down with him. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face and spat out his final, desperate threat. He loudly declared that we were still legally married under state law. He aggressively reminded me that he was legally entitled to exactly 50% of all our marital assets, including the massive equity in the sprawling suburban home we shared. Furthermore, he threatened to drag me through a brutal, agonizingly public custody battle, vowing to use every dirty trick in the legal playbook to take Leo away from me just to make me suffer. He genuinely thought the threat of losing my child and half my net worth would finally make me cower in fear. I slowly walked over to the glass table, picked up a single, thin manila folder, and walked back to hand it to him. I told him to look very closely at the mortgage documents inside. I calmly explained that while he was busy playing a high-stakes corporate spy, I had done my own rigorous financial digging. The documents clearly proved that the massive, high-interest loan used to purchase our suburban house was absolutely not a joint agreement. I showed him the forensic handwriting analysis confirming that he had deliberately forged my signature on the final closing documents to secure the massive loan without my knowledge. Because of his blatant, fully documented forgery, the legal liability for that crushing debt rested entirely and exclusively on his shoulders. He was not getting 50% of any equity, because there was no equity left. He was walking away from our marriage with absolutely nothing but a colossal, unpayable mountain of fraudulent debt, and the federal agents waiting just a few feet away to place him under arrest. The family court proceedings were remarkably swift, entirely devoid of the drawn-out, theatrical drama Greg had so arrogantly threatened to unleash. He sat slumped across the wide center aisle, looking like a hollow, pathetic shell of the polished man I once knew. Because his personal accounts had been completely frozen during the initial fraud investigation, he was forced to be represented by a visibly exhausted, overworked public defender who clearly knew this was a losing battle. Silas, stepping in personally as my lead counsel, did not just present a standard legal case, he executed a flawless, devastating legal slaughter. He methodically laid out the undeniable, horrifying proof of Greg abandoning a freezing, helpless infant on a dark, isolated highway in the middle of a severe storm. He backed my harrowing testimony with certified weather reports, localized cell tower data that tracked his exact cowardly movements that terrible night, and the damning audio of my frantic emergency calls. Then came the devastating financial records. Silas presented the massive mountain of fraudulent debt Greg had secretly accumulated, placing the forged mortgage documents directly into the court record for everyone to see. The presiding judge, a formidable, stern woman with zero tolerance for domestic abusers and manipulators, looked down at Greg with absolute, unfiltered disgust. She did not deliberate for long. Her heavy wooden gavel struck the polished block with the deafening finality of a closing coffin. She immediately and permanently stripped Greg of all visitation and custody rights, officially declaring him a severe, documented physical and emotional danger to his own son. But her righteous fury did not stop there. To legally compensate for the extreme, calculated emotional distress, the profound trauma, and the deliberate financial sabotage I had endured for 5 long years, She ordered the immediate liquidation and total transfer of every single separate asset Greg still possessed: his beloved vintage sports car, his hidden personal savings accounts, his expensive luxury watch collection. Every last item of value was to be handed over to me immediately. He was left with absolutely nothing but the wrinkled suit on his back and the crushing, fraudulent, multi-million-dollar debt he had arrogantly created. As the judge formally adjourned the hearing and gathered her files, Greg let out a ragged, shaking breath, likely thinking the absolute worst was finally over and he could just crawl away to hide. He was entirely, devastatingly wrong. The heavy, reinforced oak doors at the very back of the courtroom swung open with a loud bang. 4 stern, heavily armed federal investigators, the exact same agents who had been meticulously cataloging the digital evidence in Silas's living room, marched decisively down the center aisle. They did not even wait for Greg to stand up. They loudly and publicly read the federal arrest warrants, officially charging him and Clara, who was simultaneously being apprehended by a tactical team at her upscale corporate townhouse with massive commercial fraud, international wire manipulation, and a highly organized conspiracy to misappropriate protected trust assets. The cold, sharp, metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping tightly around Greg's wrists echoed loudly in the completely silent room. The federal agents hauled him up roughly by his shoulders as they marched him forcefully out of the double doors and into the bright, unforgiving, fluorescent light of the crowded courthouse hallway. His trembling legs completely gave out beneath him. The once arrogant, untouchable corporate spy collapsed heavily onto the hard linoleum floor. He began to weep violently, sobbing aloud like a broken, terrified child, the heavy chains rattling loudly against the floorboards as he desperately begged for mercy that no one was going to give him. It was a pathetic, agonizing sight, serving as a powerful, glaring warning to anyone who ever believed they could manipulate sacred love and weaponize a family purely to satisfy their own bottomless greed. I walked right past him without a single backward glance, my head held incredibly high, my posture unshakable. Later that evening, the heavy, oppressive storm clouds that had haunted the city for weeks finally broke apart, giving way to a calm, beautifully clear twilight. I was back in the quiet, secure sanctuary of the penthouse overlooking the glowing city. Silas walked over to me, holding a worn, heavily weathered, leather-bound notebook in his hands. He gently explained that it was the true diary of my father, the final, most precious piece of the trust meant exclusively for my eyes. I gently opened the fragile, yellowed pages. Inside, written in a hurried, brilliant scrawl, were decades of profound, undeniable love. My father wrote extensively about his agonizing choice, the terrifying, ruthless tech underworld that desperately wanted to weaponize his creation, and his desperate, nightly prayer that his forced absence would buy me a lifetime of peace and safety. He had loved me enough to let me hate him, all just to keep me alive. The tears I cried that night were not of sorrow, but of profound healing and immense gratitude. Exactly 1 month later, I officially turned 32 years old. The complex, unbreakable temporal lock on the hidden trust dissolved perfectly, and the monumental core algorithm, along with the massive accumulated wealth, legally became mine. But I had absolutely no desire to keep a piece of technology that had caused so much destruction, attracted so much evil, and cost my father his life. Instead of selling it to the highest corporate bidder, I worked with Silas to negotiate a massive, heavily regulated buyout with a global medical research organization dedicated entirely to public health and disease eradication. They intended to use the advanced predictive code to accelerate cellular tracking and develop life-saving cures. I took the very thing that destroyed my family and turned it into a powerful instrument for global healing, securing a massive, entirely clean fortune for myself in the process. My story finally comes to a close today, a lifetime away from that freezing, terrifying Portland road. I am standing proudly on the lush, green lawn of my beautiful new private estate. The warm morning sun washing brightly over the pristine white walls and the vibrant, blooming flower beds, I hold my sweet, healthy Leo tightly in my arms. He is giggling loudly, reaching his tiny, joyful hands up toward the endless, clear blue sky. We are completely independent, incredibly wealthy, and absolutely, unquestionably safe. The dark, suffocating shadows of deceit and betrayal have been permanently banished from our lives. For the very first time in my entire existence, I am looking forward to a beautiful, untethered future without a single drop of fear. Thank you so very much for taking the time to listen to my journey today. I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from, so please let me know down in the comments. If you found my story compelling and want to help support our channel, please consider assisting us with just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the direct PayPal link provided in the description and the pinned comment below. Your kindness ensures our dedicated staff can feed their families and continue bringing you more powerful stories. Thank you again, and take care of yourselves.